Hello, my name is Michael Crute.
And I'm Justin Anderson.
And we are the Welcome Home Atlanta team. We are both realtors with Keller Williams First Atlanta, and we are so honored to be in this space, this virtual space, with you for this series of community conversations called Housing, a Gothic Tale.
Absolutely.
So we are both artists and creative individuals in our own right. And when we decided to expand into real estate, we really wanted to find our heartbeat and our pulse. And we found that the intersection for us is and will always be people and their stories. You know, real estate is about so much more than buying a house or selling a house. Everyone has a pain point when they come into this arena, and our job is to help them relieve that. So we're just honored to be in this space to finally have this moment to meld our two worlds together. So we have a little bit of information for how this is going to go.
In Feeding Beatrice, a Gothic Tale, Kirsten Greenidge follows a long line of writers who have employed the mysterious, sometimes supernatural, sometimes the macabre, sometimes the horrific, in order to explore trauma, loss, and grief within individuals, families, and communities with the intent to suss out the root of that pain. And if you're thinking about contemporary similarities, I think of Jordan Peele's Get Out, or Us, or Mike Flanagan's series The Haunting of Hill House, or Midnight Mass, which we just watched a few weeks ago. And the whole intent is, if that story is written well, that you are going to see a reflection not only of yourself, but of your collective community and culture, a past, present, and future version of that. I think of like the past pain, the present moment, and the future possibility. And there's the thing that I think is really weaving through this play is that dialogue between past, present, and future. And so I want to read a quote from one of the characters, Leroy, and I think he sums up the heartbeat of the play like this: "You can't just bury the past. You bury it, and any way it can, it's going to rise up and live again. The past always comes creeping back around. It's always there. The past breeds the present. The present breeds the answer if we listen." So over the next few weeks, we're going to be exploring the past, present, and future implications of housing, particularly as it relates to policy, accessibility, and equity. And we're going to do that through the lens of the 5 major systems of a house, which are roof, foundation, plumbing, electricity, and HVAC. So today we're starting with the roof and the foundation, the literal structure of a home, so we can unpack the scaffolding, the history of what got us to this play.
Gotcha.
You're gonna find a ton of resources on our landing page, but today the resource that we wanted to highlight and feature is a short film called Segregated by Design, written by Mark Lopez and Richard Rothstein, directed by Mark Lopez. And we're gonna watch it in real time with you and have some commentary throughout the piece.
Yeah, imagine this kind of like a reaction video, if you will. The information that's in this and woven all throughout this short film is so potent that we didn't want to water it down.
And also not reinvent the wheel. We really do feel like this is a great resource to share in having this discussion and this dialogue. And then there are just some things that, you know, have pinged for me and probably have, you know, hit a different note for Justin. And we just want to be able to share kind of this experience, kind of like a group watch party. So we hope that you will join us as we watch Segregated by Design. We're not going to do the whole thing. We'll do, you know, segments and clips throughout. And we hope that as you watch it, it's either preparing you for seeing the play if you haven't seen it yet, or it's giving you a richer, deeper, even more rooted context as to why the play is what it is and why it was written the way that it was written, if you've already seen it.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
In the middle of the 20th century, the city of St. Louis, Missouri, and the United States federal government condemned and demolished the neighborhoods in downtown St. Louis where African Americans lived, displacing thousands. They built the Gateway Arch. They built a university, interstate highways, hospitals, and middle-class housing that was unaffordable to the former African American residents. Those who were displaced then relocated to the few other places available, converting inner-ring suburbs like Ferguson into new segregated enclaves. We have been led to believe that racial segregation in housing was de facto segregation, by accident or the result of private prejudices. Yes, private prejudice clearly contributed to segregation, but by itself it could not have segregated the country without the intention of the federal government to segregate neighborhoods throughout the nation. If, however, we understand the accurate history, the history that was once well known but we've all now forgotten, that racially segregated patterns in every metropolitan area like St. Louis were created by de jure segregation, racially explicit policy on the part of federal, state, and local governments designed to segregate metropolitan areas, then we can understand that we have an unconstitutional residential landscape. And if it's unconstitutional, then we have an obligation to remedy it.
So something that I took away from that is, I don't know about you, but for me, I always thought this experience, right, that it was just, you know, what they call de facto, right? It was just people and, you know, people not getting along and people making decisions to separate or to come closer. You know, I always thought it was just people. I never really thought it was policy until I got into real estate and started doing my own research and my own kind of digging and exploring. And this is nationwide. This isn't like reserved to one particular state.
And I think there is a quick assumption, or maybe, you know, maybe it's we don't want to think holistically, that this was just a problem in the South.
Right.
Absolutely not.
No. I mean, case in point, they said St. Louis, Missouri.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
And I mean, I know about Levittown and like...
For sure, and that's going to be coming up in the video in just a little bit, but I think we like to think, oh, it was such a problem, or maybe so manifested in the South. Mm-hmm. No, the South they wore it on their sleeves. But up in the North, or the Midwest, or out West, the same things were going on. It was just masked in a different way. And a lot of it was tied to actual policy, right? And the way that, when I think of policy, I think of people. I think that's what policy is. Policy is for people. Mm-hmm. It's created by people for people, right? And so I think if we can start to untangle that idea of policy being this, I don't know, this separate sort of thing. It's like this austere law. No, the heartbeat of that, what it actually is people. Yeah. It's affecting people.
Yeah.
And I think you're absolutely right. That notion that these things, what we perceive to be division and eruption and discord between, particularly within the lens of race, or through the lens of race. Yeah. People have said, "Oh, it's organic. It's just by nature." And this thing, no, it's so much been framed and formulated by policy.
Yeah.
The federal government in the New Deal of the Roosevelt administration of the 1930s pursued policies in the mid-20th century that segregated metropolitan areas. One important policy was the first civilian public housing program, which frequently demolished integrated neighborhoods in order to create segregated public housing. In the late 1930s, another New Deal program, the United States Housing Authority, was adopted. The very first projects built under the United States Housing Authority authorization were in Austin, Texas, because the most aggressive proponent of public housing at that time was the congressman from Austin, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson got the United States Housing Authority to put its first projects in Austin, separate projects for whites, for African Americans, and a project for Hispanics. The project for African Americans was placed in a location that the city plan of Austin had designated as a ghetto for African Americans. The United States Housing Authority and the local Austin Housing Authority demolished something called Emancipation Park, which was a celebrations location for the abolition of slavery. The design was to move all African Americans in the city of Austin into this community, whether in public housing or in private housing. The city of Austin then began to close schools for African Americans elsewhere in the city and close libraries and other public facilities to force African Americans to move to the east side. Another program that the federal government pursued to enforce segregation was the work of the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which subsidized the development of suburbs like Levittown, New York, on condition that they only be sold to white families and that the homes in those suburbs had deeds that prohibited resale to African Americans. The Federal Housing Administration's underwriting manual said that inharmonious racial groups should not be permitted to live in the same communities, meaning that loans to African Americans could not be insured. Government at all levels throughout the nation were involved in promoting and enforcing the restrictive deeds in homes and places like Levittown, and judges enforced the view that these deeds did not violate the Constitution because they were private agreements. Although white middle-class families that moved into suburbs like Levittown could buy property with no down payments if they were veterans and low-interest mortgages, middle-class African Americans had to make substantial down payments and get uninsured mortgages with higher interest rates. In many, if not most cases, African Americans could not get mortgages at all because the federal government would not insure them. As a result, they bought their homes on contract, like an installment plan where they accumulated no equity and could be evicted from their homes in the event of a single missed payment. Thus, contract buyers do not have the option of leaving a declining neighborhood before their properties were paid for in full. If they did, they would lose everything they'd invested in that property to date.
Well, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. The thing with history, right, and looking through the lens of history, right, is that oftentimes we want to look at history through modern lenses, right? So even in looking back at the policies that were written, right, I being an African American man, like I have to look at what the mentality and like essentially what was culture like then that these policies were put in place. Doesn't make them right by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one of those things where I can't take my modern day approach and the advancements and the progressions that we've had to, look back and be like, these people were crazy. I will say, taking all that into consideration, I do think something that regardless of the time, era, space that we're in, is the, when you talk about the deliberate acts, the deliberate act of closing schools, the deliberate act of closing public facilities, the deliberate act of essentially herding people into a condensed area, right? That is the thing that I really struggle with understanding. I think the other thing that they hit on that I think is mind-blowing is the purchasing of homes on contract.
Oh, and I did not know that until the first time that I saw this short.
Buying homes on contract, right? Like, so from a real estate standpoint, right, buying a home on contract is no different really than renting.
Correct.
Or being on a lease, which is a contract.
Yeah.
So here you are in this home and you are putting money into this home, paying your rent every month. And for those contracts, those were much longer contracts. So it wasn't like a 1-year lease at an apartment complex, right? Imagine a 30-year lease that you're paying on and you don't
First
get
of all,
any
you're not
equity.
accruing any
You don't
equity
accrue
from that.
any equity from that.
And if you walk away,
You lose everything. Like,
so I hope you can already see where this is heading as it relates to feeding Beatrice. It's literally within the fabric of the house. It's within it's also metabolized into a cellular level for Lori and June. And you see how this plays out in the way that they behave based on their connection to the home, the desperation to prove their worth within a community, that they belong here. And, for June in particular, willing to go to any length necessary to stay.
yeah.
Because this is so much, it becomes so much a part of her identity.
Yeah, it's so much bigger than the house.
Absolutely.
It is about everything that the house stands for. It's about all the challenges and obstacles and all of the no's of don't.
Yeah, the
you
no's
can't.
of the last 70 years.
Yeah. To be in this place now of I'm in this home, it's quote unquote perfect.
There's a lot of imposter syndrome going on.
Oh yeah.
The term redlining comes from the federal government's creation of maps of urban areas nationwide. And those maps were color-coded to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. Anywhere African Americans lived, even places where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky for the FHA to insure. The FHA's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in white neighborhoods, or even if they bought homes near those neighborhoods, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. In 1940, for example, a Detroit builder was denied FHA insurance for a project that was near an African American neighborhood. He then constructed a half-mile concrete wall, 6 feet high and a foot thick, separating the two neighborhoods, and then the FHA approved the loan. In the 3 decades during which it administered this policy, however, the agency never provided or obtained evidence to support its claim that integration undermined property values. In fact, often racial integration caused property values to increase because African Americans' housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. If African Americans had access to housing throughout metropolitan areas, supply and demand balances would have kept their rents and home prices at reasonable levels. Without access, landlords and sellers were free to take advantage of the greater demand relative to supply for African American housing. A 1946 National Magazine article described a Chicago building where the landlord had divided a 540 square foot storefront into 6 cubicles, each housing a family. He had similarly subdivided the second story. Total monthly rent was as great as that generated by a luxury apartment on Chicago's Gold Coast along Lake Michigan. Such exploitation was possible only because public policy denied African Americans opportunities to participate in the city's white housing market.
For me, this is like, it kind of wraps everything up into a pretty neat package to understand what we're talking about in terms of the past and the policies and how we got here. What I think is so incredible about this section is the fact that the entire notion, that entire concept that people of color would lower property values was propagated by the federal government, not by what we all were taught was like, it's just, individual people, like just people just think that. It was, no, as you can see, it was like evidence. You created this narrative that we're not going to insure homes being built in communities of color because we have this belief as the government that insuring these homes in these areas next to these white homes, that it's going to somehow affect property values.
Yeah, it's too risky.
It's too risky. We've assessed and we've put risk associated with the color of somebody's skin as though that were
an actual factor.
Right. Now, the thing that I think is really a big takeaway, because we are in the throes of this right now, if we look at today's housing market and the limit, like the condensed pile of inventory that we have, and all of the crazy things you hear on the news about people waiving appraisals and going $25,000 over and all of this stuff, imagine that during this time for African Americans.
Or any
because the
color.
Supply of houses, the inventory of homes for African Americans
that they were even eligible for.
That they were eligible was so limited, right? That landlords and homeowners were able to take advantage of this group of people who were just simply looking to buy a home. And right now, I think we can all relate to how egregious that is, because in this market, we think it's crazy, right? So it doesn't make it any less crazy being, a handful of decades ago.
We are literally, ladies and gentlemen, more than 7 million units short in this country.
Yes.
Meaning there is a dearth of 7 million homes for eligible, qualified home buyers, people that want to buy. And that has been an issue since the end of World War II.
So I think this section is really incredible to kind of unpack, because in the play we hear a lot. We hear a lot of the tension between Lurie and June around money. June has this, this desire to make everything in the house perfect and wants to spend money that they don't have.
Right.
And Lurie is trying to, kind of hold on to the purse strings and be like, it can get done, it's just gonna have to be little by little, right? That brings me to just the notion and the concept of affordable housing, right? I think in our society and in culture today, there has been this negative connotation also that has started to come and formulate around affordable housing as though it's a poor versus rich, and It's not. It's proportionate. It's affordable housing proportionate to your income. And by definition, really, you could probably find a couple of definitions, but the definition that I will probably stick with is affordable housing is when your mortgage payment is no more than 30% of your income, right? So affordable housing is essentially saying we want you to have housing where you're not paying more than 30% of your income or directing more than 30% of your income to just the mortgage note, right? And by doing that, that's how you are able to create these diverse and robust communities that have frontline workers and firefighters and teachers,
doctors, accountants, people that have a variety of careers and probably are making a variety of ranges of money. But they're living in proximity. They're literally engaging in community with one another.
As the federal government concentrated low-income African Americans in single neighborhoods, the homes became overcrowded. Families had to subdivide their homes to make their mortgage payments or their property tax payments. Cities frequently withdrew public services from African American neighborhoods. They collected garbage less frequently. They didn't provide water and sewer services. Polluting industry and toxic waste plants were placed in African American communities in order to protect white neighborhoods from deterioration. The result was that African American neighborhoods frequently turned into slums. White homeowners looked at these places and assumed that slum conditions were characteristics of African Americans, not of government policy that forced this kind of overcrowding. White homeowners then became resistant to African Americans moving into their neighborhoods because they thought they would bring slum conditions with them. Of course, the slums were not created by the people. They were created by the forced concentration, the overcrowding in these neighborhoods. Blockbusting was a scheme in which speculators bought properties in borderline black-white areas, rented or sold them to African-American families at above-market prices, persuaded white families residing in these areas that their neighborhoods were turning into African-American slums and that values would soon fall precipitously, and then purchased the panicked white homes for less than their worth. Blockbusters' tactics included hiring African-American women to push carriages with their babies through white neighborhoods, hiring African-American men to drive cars with radios blasting through white neighborhoods, or making random telephone calls to residents of white neighborhoods and asking to speak to someone with a stereotypically African-American name, like Johnny May. State licensing agencies that regulated real estate agents could have easily stopped this practice. All they had to do was to lift the license of one or two real estate agents who engaged in these practices, and the practices would have ended. While many de jure segregation policies aimed to keep African Americans far from white residential areas, public officials also shifted African American populations away from downtown business districts so that white commuters, shoppers, and business elites would not be exposed to black people. This was accomplished with slum clearance. One slum clearance tool was the construction of a federal interstate highway system. In many cases, state and local governments, with federal acquiescence, designed interstate highway routes to destroy urban African American communities. In the 1950s, there was a white middle-class neighborhood in Los Angeles that wealthy African Americans began to move into. It was called Sugar Hill. The first thing that happened was that the neighborhood association got together and tried to buy out the African American families who were moving in, offering them more money than the African Americans had paid in order to get them out of the neighborhood. When that didn't work, white homeowners tried to enforce a legal agreement prohibiting them from living in the neighborhood. And when that didn't work, the city council then decided it would be an African American neighborhood. It rezoned it for multiple family housing. It eventually became a slum. And then the Santa Monica Freeway was built to clear that slum to destroy the neighborhood. So these policies all worked together in an unconstitutional fashion to segregate Los Angeles.
one of the takeaways for me is the inherent responsibility that we have as realtors engaging in this kind of work. You see what was perpetuated, obviously not just by a handful of agents, but by a tremendous amount across the country. And again, first of all, perpetuating fear, affirming a false narrative, and then profiting off of that. It's despicable.
Yeah. The responsibility of real estate agents is to protect consumers in the buying and the selling of real estate. That is what we are supposed to do, is to protect consumers. And what is clearly evidenced in this section is the exploitation and the manipulation of consumers, which is why real estate agents as a profession ranks lower than used car salesmen in terms of consumer trust. It's that thing. It's that dialogue, right, that happens when you move into something new, right? It's like, well, that wasn't me. I wasn't a part of that.
Sure.
But we have a shared responsibility and an accountability to correct, essentially.
Not even correct. I think we're stepping into an arena where there were some egregious things that happened in the past. I think we have to recognize that. It's not necessarily taking responsibility for what happened in the past, but I am sure as hell going to take responsibility that something like that never happens again in the future.
Well, I would push back. I would push back on that, because I think it is our job to accept responsibility for that in terms of being accountable to what happened, so that something different can happen.
Right.
Because you can't have accountability
without accepting responsibility.
Right. You can't try to progress something forward without acknowledging.
I wasn't saying that as a dismissal of it has nothing to do with me. Does that make sense?
Yeah. But that's where I think the
right.
line is, right? It's like, I came into a thing and like I wasn't a part of that. So, it's just like if you joined into a group project, right? You got put in the group project at the last second. It's like, all the stuff that the rest of the group members did prior to me getting here, no, I had no part in it, but I have to come in and be like, this is where we're at now, and this is everything that happened to get us to here, so that we can figure out a different path forward.
In light of how that then affects reputation or perception, whether it's as real estate agents or as any other label that you want to put on a person, I think then you're right, there is a degree of responsibility that has to become a catalyst for, here's what it is. As I'm working through this, accepting that responsibility is both a part of the awareness and the mindset shift that then informs the behavior that can change thereafter.
Exactly.
Right? So not only am I responsible to myself and to my constituents and my clients, but I'm also responsible to the profession, to making sure in doing what I can to ensure that those things don't occur again.
Right.
That those policies aren't replicated, or any sniff of them is not being replicated, that there is no explanation.
Because now that I hold myself accountable to that, I can now hold other people accountable to it too.
And that's why the more that we do this and we engage with clients, and the more that even taking in this information, responding to it again, it is so important to align yourself with people that you trust. It doesn't matter if it's a real estate agent, if it's your doctor, if it's a lawyer, if it's your hairstylist,
tax professional,
whatever that is. I think that has to be a bedrock.
Yes.
And I know I'm probably articulating something that seems so obvious and inherent, but I think for many of us, we do ourselves a disservice when we don't consider enough the cost of what a misaligned relationship with somebody providing a service for us could do.
Yeah.
Or what that cost could be.
Today, African American incomes are about 60% of white incomes. But African American wealth is about 10% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 10% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African-American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. Across the country in new developments, these homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 to $400,000 at the minimum, 6 to 8 times national median income. The white families sent their children to college with the wealth they gained from appreciating home equity. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They were able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans who, for the most part, were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. So in 1968, we passed the Fair Housing Act that said, in effect, okay, African Americans, you're now free to buy homes in the suburbs that had been forbidden. But it's an empty promise, because those homes are no longer affordable to the families whose parents or grandparents could have afforded them when whites were buying into those suburbs and gaining the equity and wealth that followed from their purchases.
All right, so I just want to do some really quick math here to try to break that down into some concrete figures, okay? So what he said was that at the time, in the 1940s, 1950s, the homes were selling for about 2 times, maybe to 3 times the national median income. So let's just say, right, let's just use an arbitrary number. Let's just say the national median income was $50,000. That means people were buying homes that were $100,000, $150,000, but they were earning $50,000. Then in 1968, right, and actually, backtrack, there were, but African Americans were also making the same amount of money, $50,000, but were not able to purchase these homes at $100,000, $150,000. Now, fast forward to 1968, when the Fair Housing Act comes into play, and it's like, now you can buy these homes. Okay, well, that is 20 years of appreciation on a $150,000 asset.
Which typically averages about 4% a year.
A year.
Sometimes more.
Well, and looking at the fact now those homes that at the time were affordable, right?
Are completely
are now $400,000 homes, and I still make $50,000 a year. So in terms of that wealth gap, that is a giant gap that can't just be
and we see
recovered.
We see it represented in the play. You have June and Laurie they're both gainfully employed.
Yeah.
Making, from all intents and purposes, that we can assume is a really decent salary, and yet they are stretched to the nth degree to be able to afford this home. Mm-hmm. And so there is an implication that had there been an ability early on to build generational wealth within family, if back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, their ancestors had been able to purchase, then that actually may have set them up, not actually may have, it would have set them up.
Yes.
For a much more affordable and stable future. Not just them, probably a variety of branches on that family tree.
Correct.
And the other thing that's so interesting to me, just as it relates to that notion of the wealth gap and just money in general as it plays throughout the text and the characters, is Beatrice and her absolute, it's almost it's a sad fascination with June being a banker.
Yeah.
And this sort of explosive idea of, oh, they let you handle money? Wow. It's appalling. And I deeply offensive just reading it and experiencing it. You have to imagine like what that would be like. And it's coming from a 60-year-old kid, right? And yet, what we see as the play progresses, right, is there still is this desire to want to, Beatrice essentially becomes the surrogate of the neighborhood, the emblem of the neighborhood, right? Mm-hmm. Even with all of that pelting of offense and no real sense of empathy or understanding, a real evident sense of superiority in so many ways, June is still working so hard to get Beatrice's approval.
Which is, that's something.
Again, it's
that's something.
And it's all fueled by the framework of this history that's supporting it.
June has this, she keeps repeating, it has to be perfect, has to be perfect.
Yeah.
For the adoption lady, for our family, for us to be able to, it has to be perfect, right? We talk about all of these different intersection points, right? The fact that she does not see that a home could be perfect in a different community is also just like that's a whole thing.
Yeah.
That's a whole thing. So that brings this community conversation to a close, and we are so thankful and honored to be in this space with you, this virtual space with you, to host and to launch this series of community conversations, Housing, a Gothic Tale. I know that this is a hard topic. I know that this is not easy. This is really muddy and mucky, and it doesn't really feel good, but this is so important. And I'm so glad that you guys sat with us through this, because it is our job and our responsibility, like we were talking about earlier. We have a shared responsibility, a shared accountability to understanding what was the policies. No, none of us had any hand in creating any of those policies or the scaffolding, right? But we do live in community with one another. We do rub up against one another. We are in a beautiful tapestry of living, right? And so it is our responsibility to find ways to build and advocate for more equitable policies that's gonna better our entire community.
Yeah. Everything belongs. Past,
belongs.
present, and future. And, as I reflected on that quote from Leroy earlier in the conversation, the past is always going to creep in to the present. And I think we have to allow that to occur. I think you have to figure out a way to navigate and dance with the past, right? If you try to dismiss it, and sort of stick your head in the sand or just do the la la la, it never happened, and live in that state of denial, and there really will never be any potential for individual or collective growth.
Yeah.
So using the past to understand the present, so hopefully we can create a better future, is really what this series is about, and hopefully what one of the many things that you're gleaning from your experience with the play. We want to keep the conversation going. We want it to be a conversation.
Yes.
We've been talking.
Yes.
But we hope that you'll reach out to us with thoughts and questions and concerns and things that resonated with you or that were very hard for you, or maybe something that you need more clarity about, or you want more information regarding. We would love to continue to be a resource with you. We will be moderating the future conversations to come. Next week begins a 2-part series looking at the energy of a house. We're using the system of plumbing and electricity to look at the present energy of what's going on in the world of the play, but also in our present time.
Yeah.
So you'll definitely want to join us for that. All of our resources will be on our landing page, and we do hope to see you at the theater for Feeding Beatrice, a Gothic Tale by Kirsten Greenidge.